What's going on, APUSH people? We have the Mexican-American War as a turning point in U.S. history, a very important topic in U.S. history that we will have you covered in case you have an essay on the Mexican-American War. Before we begin, it's shout-out time. I'd like to give shout-outs to Mrs. Muller's class in Georgia, Mr. Sauer's class in Florida, Mrs. Hilton's class, and Mrs. Morris's DE U.S. history class, and Ms. McFarland's class. Thank you, everyone, for your support. It means so much. All right, so let's start off talking about the Mexican-American War. What is it? Well, as the name implies, it is a war between the U.S. and Mexico, and this really started over the Texas border dispute after Texas was annexed by the United States. And it occurred between 1846 and 1848. And the U.S. won the war, and they gained all this land over here, the Mexican cession. So the U.S. increases its size by about 1/3. And what were issues that were a result of the Mexican-American War? In one word, it's slavery. Slavery will emerge and be the #1 divisive factor in America in the late 1840s, 1850s. Okay, some key ideas before the war. Prior U.S. expansion led to debates over slavery. For instance, when the U.S. purchased the Louisiana Territory in 1803, there was controversy over whether Missouri, which was the first state out of the Louisiana Purchase to apply for statehood, should come in as a free or a slave state. This led to the Missouri Compromise, which admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, keeping that balance at 12. Both the North and the South sought to have an equal number of slave and free states, so neither one could outvote each other, the other one, in the Senate. So it's very important. Both the North and the South want to keep that number equal. Americans in the 1820s began moving into Texas in large numbers, and Texas at that time was owned by Mexico. And they actually encouraged Americans to come and settle this vast land. In 1836, Texas declared independence, and at this dude, Santa Anna, who was the president like 12 different times of Mexico, he signed a treaty recognizing Texas independence, but he later rescinded that. And in the 1840s, Manifest Destiny began to sweep the nation. John O'Sullivan coined this term, and be familiar with this wicked famous painting. And people began to expand out west in large numbers. An example of Manifest Destiny sweeping the nation is the election of 1844. James K. Polk beat Henry Clay out of nowhere, really. He was not expected to win. He beat Henry Clay because he embraced Manifest Destiny, where Henry Clay was more reserved on that issue. We also have the rise of an abolitionist movement. People like William Lloyd Garrison in his weekly newspaper, The Liberator, and he was an outspoken critic of slavery. And Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 occurred the same year as the release of The Liberator. So we have this very large slave rebellion and a weekly newspaper criticizing slavery. And that really is the emergence of the abolitionist movement on a large scale. Okay, let's jump to after the war. Manifest Destiny is complete with the continent. And the #1 question is, what is the fate of these territories, this Mexican cession? What's going to happen? Will these territories be free or slave? Well, this led to enormous debates. And if it was up to David Wilmot, a congressman from Pennsylvania, he would have said that all the territory should be free. That's what he proposed in the Wilmot Proviso. That does not end up passing. What does is the Compromise of 1850. And the first part of the Compromise of 1850 is popular sovereignty. And this stated that people living in the territories would get to vote whether or not the land would be free or slave. Now, the Gadsden Purchase happens in 1852. This is a little tiny piece of land underneath Arizona and New Mexico. And the purpose of this purchase was to create a transcontinental railroad in the South. The South, it looked like, was going to get the railroad first. Now, 2 years later, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed because the North wanted a railroad, specifically Stephen Douglas. He wanted to create a transcontinental railroad in the North, so he needed to incorporate these territories to allow the railroad to pass through it. So let's jump to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This overturns the Missouri Compromise because both Kansas and Nebraska were above that 3630 line. According to the Missouri Compromise, they should have been free. And remember, Kansas and Nebraska are both in the Louisiana Purchase territory. But the South would not allow 2 additional free states to be added to the Union. So the North is furious. And again, the issue here is slavery. So Kansas-Nebraska introduces popular sovereignty with the idea that Kansas would be slave and Nebraska would be free. This leads to Bleeding Kansas, in which many people go and vote in Kansas, and fighting breaks out. John Brown comes from the East Coast with some of his children and attacks and kills 5 pro-slavery individuals in Kansas. And this happened just a couple days after the caning of Charles Sumner. This is a direct reason for the emergence of the political party, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And the Republican Party sought to limit slavery, sought to keep slavery from expanding. They were against the extension of slavery. This is a free soil platform. Again, they favored stopping the expansion of slavery. Okay, so let's talk about how this war was a turning point. Well, for some changes. See the growth of the abolitionist movement after. The other part of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act, and this infuriated many people in the North. Harriet Beecher Stowe will write Uncle Tom's Cabin in response to this. And this act required many Northerners to get involved in the capture of runaway slaves. So while the abolitionist movement was growing, it explodes after the war. We see increased sectional tensions, whether it's Bleeding Kansas or even in the Senate with the caning of Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts by a Southern member of the House of Representatives, Preston Brooks. And you have the issue of popular sovereignty. So it's the people now who are deciding the fate of the territories. It's no longer the government. Some continuities are things that remain the same. You see restrictions and tightening of African American rights, especially in the South. As more people are screaming for abolitionism, slave owners tend to be more restrictive of their slaves. And we see the spread of slavery out west that began with the Louisiana Purchase in the early 1800s. And now slavery is trying to spread out to the Mexican Cession territory. You have different labor systems continuing. Slavery is becoming further entrenched in the South, and the North is becoming more and more reliant on free labor. Now, for a possible synthesis point, connecting the Mexican-American War to the Civil War. And you could also compare debates over the Mexican Cession to debates over expansion after the Spanish-American War, in which the U.S. acquired territories, especially those in the Philippines. There are lots of debates over what would happen to the fate of those territories. All right, for some test tips, multiple choice and short answer. Definitely know the impacts of the war on slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, that to me is screaming a great excerpt for multiple choice questions or any sort of opposition to the war as an excerpt. And of course, Manifest Destiny. For essays, the war is a turning point. For slavery debates or the issue of slavery, and evaluating how Manifest Destiny helped contribute to debates over slavery. Finally, you could see comparing and contrasting arguments for and against expansion. That will tie into Manifest Destiny and slavery. So it's kind of a combination of the two. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. Please check out my playlist on turning points. I have many other turning point videos in there and will continue to add. Best of luck on all your exams, especially the one in May. And tell me, I know this is kind of blurry, but are you aware of what this is a picture of? I'll give you a hint. The event is from 1859. Thank you guys for watching. I do appreciate it, and have a good day.